Good evening. We're grateful to once again be out to worship God in spirit and in truth. That's why we've come together for the purpose of worshiping Him, as well as to encourage one another and to edify one another. We're grateful that we have that opportunity, and we pray that we never take it for granted. And I hope that you have been uplifted by this, and I hope that most of all that God has been praised and adored and glorified in our worship. Go ahead and turn over to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. We've been studying through the book of Genesis on Sunday nights for quite some time now, and we're getting there. We're getting pretty close to the end. But we started all the way back in Genesis 37, what is typically known as kind of Joseph's part of the book. And we noted how Genesis 37 deals with Joseph as kind of almost a main character, and then he's sold into slavery, and then we have this abrupt break where it doesn't talk about Joseph, but it talks about Judah in chapter 38. Well, now we're in chapter 39, and now we're back to talking about Joseph, and we will be talking about him through pretty much the rest of the book. But I will remind you what it says in Genesis chapter 37 at the beginning at verse 2, where it says, "These are the records of the generations of Jacob." And so, as we're going through, whether we're talking about Joseph or Judah or whoever else we're talking about in these last chapters, the writer seems to understand this as all talking about the generations of Jacob and his family and all of that. So that's how we should keep it in mind. But let's talk about Joseph. Joseph in Potiphar's house. Start reading with me in verse 1, and we're going to cut off kind of in the middle of verse 6 because that just seemed like a natural breaking point to me. But let's start reading in verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph, and thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. So let's stop there for just a moment and talk about Joseph in Potiphar's house, the beginning of this relationship, at least from our perspective. Joseph had been sold by his brothers to some Ishmaelites, and these Ishmaelites continued on from the land of Canaan down to Egypt, and they were continuing on. Eventually they meet Potiphar, and Potiphar's looking to buy some slaves, presumably. And he buys Joseph from them, perhaps others as well. But let's talk about Potiphar and who he is. It says that Potiphar is an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard. So he was an important person, not the most important person, but he was an important person to Pharaoh. You think of the bodyguard as those who were directly watching over Pharaoh and making sure that he was safe. We might think of it perhaps as the Secret Service today for the president. I take this to be the same kind of thing, that he was chief over these people who were keeping an eye on Pharaoh and keeping him safe. So Potiphar is an important person and has political power, and that is important to think about as we go along with this story. But also, one thing that we want to notice, something that is going to be said over and over again throughout this narrative is that the Lord was with Joseph. You might just look at it now and start counting. Start counting as we go through Genesis 39 and 40 and 40 and 41. How many times it mentions that God is with Joseph? I'd wager it's probably more than two hands can say, though I haven't done the count myself, but that would just be my guess. I think we're going to see this a lot as we continue on. God was with Joseph in his time of trouble. This is not a good thing that happened to Joseph, being sold into slavery. And yet, in this time of trouble, God allows Joseph to prosper. And Joseph becomes a successful man. Though he is a slave in an Egyptian's house, he becomes successful, as far successful as he can be in that situation. And what I mean by that is Potiphar makes him overseer over his house. All that he owned is put into Joseph's charge. Verse 6 says, he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. The only thing that Potiphar had to worry about was what he was going to eat for the day. Everything else Joseph took care of. That's how much Potiphar trusted Joseph in this case, and how powerful Joseph became in Potiphar's house. And I imagine that this could have gone on forever. It could have gone on to where perhaps if Potiphar had no heirs, Joseph could have inherited Potiphar's estate and become a wealthy Egyptian himself, and that could have been the story there. But we know that that's not the case, because there comes some trouble in this narrative. Continuing on in the second half of Genesis chapter 39 and verse 6, it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. It came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. So the trouble that comes upon Joseph is Potiphar's wife. For whatever reason, her eye takes to Joseph. Now, it says that Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. He would have been between 17 and 30 at this point, probably on the younger side of that. So maybe in his early 20s, we could possibly say. We know he was 17 when he was given his coat. We know that he was 30 when he's made governor, not to spoil the end of the story, but when he's made governor over Egypt, he's 30. So sometime in between that is what we're talking about. I would say probably in his younger 20s. And Potiphar's wife, we don't know much about her other than what is told in these few verses. We don't know her character other than she's wanting to commit an adulterous relationship. We don't know anything about her standing, nothing. However, we can perhaps infer some things. They're not necessary inferences, but I think that they are likely. Potiphar is in a place of political power, and typically when you have that kind of political power, you marry an attractive person. That would have been the custom of the day. And so it's not unreasonable to think that Potiphar's wife was attractive, and on the relatively young side, even if Potiphar was not. And the only other thing that we need to know about her is that she took an interest in Joseph. It says that she looked with desire at Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But then we have Joseph's refusal. Joseph refuses this advance from Potiphar's wife. He says, "Look, I've been treated well here by Potiphar. Everything in his house is under my command, and he's not withheld anything from me except for you, because you're his wife." And he says, "How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" He sees not only as this a sin against Potiphar, but ultimately as a sin against God to commit adultery with Potiphar's wife. And so he refuses. But this is not just a one-time thing that happens with Potiphar's wife. It says that she spoke to Joseph day after day. Now, he refused every single time. But have you ever thought about how long day after day was? Could have been weeks. Could have been months. Could have even been years. We just don't know. But it speaks to Joseph's character that he refuses as he does over and over and over again in this case. As I said, Potiphar's wife was very well could have been attractive. Joseph was a young man, and this temptation, for whatever it's worth, is appealing to young men as opposed to older men. I mean, it's appealing to all men, but apparently even more so for younger men. And one thing that could be appealing about this is that a lot of times it seemed like it was just Joseph and her in the house. That's what happened on the day that she caught him by the garment. It was just Joseph and her in the house. No one would have known. And so you have that added into the temptation. You have all these things building up to make for the quote-unquote perfect sin. The sin that you can get away with, that no one knows about, that appeals to you. And yet, in every case, Joseph turned away from this. And it shows his character that was already there. We think of Joseph as a man of character, maybe perhaps later in his life, but even in this moment, Joseph is a man of character who refuses to sin against his master, yes, but also to sin against God. So she catches Joseph by his garment and says, "Lie with me." And this time, presumably because of the force that she is grabbing him with, he has no choice but to leave his garment in her hand and flee. He completely removes himself from the situation. And so now Potiphar's wife is not just left with a situation where she can just move on and try again another day. She has a man's garment in her hand, and he's ran outside and perhaps caused a commotion. What is she going to do? Well, we see what she does, starting in verse 13. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, 'The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside.' Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, 'This is what your slave did to me,' his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he was there in jail." So I want to note the theater that Potiphar's wife puts on. She's left herself in a predicament, and now she has to get her way out. So she calls to the men of the household, and she says, "See, he's brought this Hebrew in to make sport of us. He came in to lie with me, and I screamed. And he left his garment, and he went outside." And I want you to notice that she says this not just to the men of the house, but when Potiphar comes home, she says almost the exact same thing. My guess is this is rehearsed. Maybe this is something she's had in her back pocket this whole time as to how to get out of it if something happened. But this seems very rehearsed and very theatrical to me. Something maybe that she had planned in case something went wrong. But she manages to convince Potiphar at least enough. It says that Potiphar's anger burned, and that's the text giving us an indication of his emotion. So he was angry. He does take Joseph and put him into jail. We don't know whether Potiphar's wife convinced the men of the household. Whose side were they on? We don't know. We don't know if Potiphar was fully convinced. If he was fully convinced that Joseph came and tried to defile his wife, why not just kill his slave? That would have been within his power. Why does he put him in jail? There are some questions here that we just don't have the answers to. But I want you to think about where Joseph is at this moment. He was humiliated by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, taken to a foreign land, and now he's a slave in somebody's house. Not a great place to be. But God prospers him. Things are starting to look up. He is second in command in the whole household. And as far as his situation dictates, that's as good as it's going to get. But then everything comes out from under him. And all of a sudden he's in prison for a crime he did not commit. Gone from a slave in a foreign land to a prisoner in a foreign land. It doesn't get much worse than that from a status point of view. But that's not where chapter 39 ends. Chapter 39 continues. It said, "But the Lord was with Joseph," verse 21, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper." So once again, notice what it says. It says it twice in these 3 verses. The Lord was with Joseph. We'll talk about why that's the case in just a moment, but I want to focus on God's loving kindness, His favor. Yes, Joseph is in a bad situation, but God allows him to rise to the top of it, to make the best of the bad situation. And in this case, Joseph finds favor in the eyes of the chief jailer. And Joseph, as far as the totem pole in this jail is concerned, Joseph is right at the top. The chief jailer would be at the top, and right under him is Joseph. And Joseph has charge of all the prisoners. All the prisoners who are in the jail, everything that is done in the jail, it's under Joseph's charge. He's responsible for it. And you start to notice a pattern that is forming that will continue to go as the story progresses. That Joseph keeps being put in charge of things. Joseph is good at being in charge of things. In Potiphar's house, only Potiphar was above him. Everybody else reported to Joseph. Everything else under Potiphar's house was under Joseph's charge. Here in the jail, Joseph shows himself to be a good steward and shows himself to be responsible. And so the chief jailer puts everything else under Joseph's charge. That's going to come into play later down the line. And again, I want to make the point that it's because the Lord was with him. But let's ask ourselves, why was the Lord with Joseph? As we're closing out this chapter and talking about conclusions to be made, why was the Lord with Joseph? Well, it comes down to his strength of character. It comes down to the kind of person that Joseph was. Now, when we saw Joseph in chapter 37, I don't think that we could say that Joseph was perfect. Joseph seemed to kind of relish in or even gloat in that he was his father's supposed favorite. He may have kind of lorded over his brothers and having charge over them. By the way, he had charge over his brothers as well, in a sense, gave a report to them, to Jacob about them. But something that we're going to continue to see about Joseph is that Joseph is making the right decisions, the righteous decisions, when no one else in this narrative is. In this chapter, we see that Potiphar didn't make the righteous decision. He did not investigate whether Joseph had done these things. Potiphar's wife certainly didn't make the righteous decision when she tried to seduce Joseph not just once, but day after day, however long that went on. None of Joseph's fellow slaves made the righteous decisions as far as they probably knew what kind of character Joseph was. And can you really keep that kind of secret for that long? Maybe somebody knew something. But Joseph, in his strength of his character, in his righteousness, stood in and did the right thing, not just once, but multiple times. The question for us is, will we have the same strength of character as Joseph? In our lives, there are going to be times where we are assaulted by Satan. And though, yes, I know it's Potiphar's wife doing the talking, no doubt Joseph was being assaulted by Satan and tempted over and over again by Satan. Will we have the strength that Joseph did to not give in? Whatever the case might be, will we have the strength to flee as Joseph fled? Joseph serves as an example for all of us of how to deal with sin when we are under fire over and over again. And because of Joseph's strength of character, the Lord was with him. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in our lives. It may be that some of us may hit rock bottom. Some of us may go to a place in our lives that we never thought we'd end up. I'm sure Joseph never thought he'd end up a slave in somebody else's house. But even if we do end up somewhere where we're not familiar with, somewhere we never thought we'd be, know that the Lord will be with us if we have the character of Joseph, if we have the righteousness that we are supposed to have. This evening, perhaps you're not a Christian. Perhaps you have not obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. Know that promise of the Lord being with you wherever you go is not something that you have at the moment. But it can be yours. And believing in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, repenting of your sins, confessing His name before men, and being baptized for the remission of sins, the Lord will keep you. The Lord will bring you home to eternity one day if you will be faithful to Him. If you are a Christian and you need the prayers of the saints, or perhaps you have not been living the way that you ought to live, there is an invitation for you as well to make things right with the Lord. And if you have any need this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?